they deliberately give you challenging jobs immediately before I was a briefer. That's where basically the Army, the Navy, the Air Force get together to discuss personnel issues.
Nick, you're the first British guy in here. I finally checked it off the diversity list.
Okay. The British are coming.
The British are coming.
Actually, the British are here.
Well, we kind of fought a war over this in 1776. It didn't go as well for you guys. I don't know if you're still bitter, but...
Well, no, we're all friends now.
That's good, but you're a New Yorker now, too.
Yes, I've lived here since August. My wife is a professor, and she got essentially headhunted. She's a visiting fellow at Heterodox Academy, so we moved to New York for a year.
And what does she do as a professor?
Physical anthropology. So she studies skeletal remains, and from that makes kind of calculations about past peoples, how they lived, how they died, their diseases, their diet, their lifestyle, all of that.
And you were saying, we were just talking off camera before you came in here, you were saying that she was under attack for identifying remains as female or something like that. Is that right?
Yes. She was due to speak at the American Anthropological Association at their annual general meeting as part of a panel to discuss the importance of biological sex. And as a physical anthropologist, Elizabeth was going to talk about how skeletal remains are of course, either male or female. And that, she was told, that's hate speech.
We are so...
It might cause harm to the LGBTQ, whatever the rest of the thing.
You did a good job.
Yeah, I was nearly there.
Yeah, you were right there.
And yeah, anyway, so all nonsense, of course, because she said, look, people can identify as whatever gender they like, but whatever you believe or identify as, your skeleton is only ever going to be male or female.
That's
when
right.
they dig you up in 10,000 years' time. No hate speech, out. So, like they say, the only time in 122-year history of the AAA that they've actually accepted a panel and then cancelled it once the Wokerati found out about it.
The Wokerati. I like that. I'm going to use that. That's really good. Well, we might have to get her in for a podcast to talk all about that. That's fascinating to me.
Well, it was a huge story. Yeah, it was.
Yeah.
It was in the New York Times. Fox News covered it. Newsmax. Lots of other places.
You guys are just a news family over there. You guys are everywhere. Can't get away from the popes.
No.
Interesting. But your whole backstory is something that people had turned me on to maybe about 6 months ago. I had been unfamiliar with your work and everything, but over here we kind of look at the Chris Mellons and the Lou Elizondos of the world as the ones who were in the U.S. government working on things that at least had to do with UFOs. Obviously, Lou was like literally the head of the ATIP desk for that. But over in Britain, you were, as I understand it, effectively at one point that guy for the British Ministry of Defence. Am I saying that correctly?
You are, yes. I was a civilian employee of the UK Ministry of Defence, which is essentially the equivalent of the DOD here. And my job, they move you around every few years. I was there, as I say, 21 years. Lots of different postings at various different grades. But from 91 through to 94, I ran their UFO program. Mm-hmm. Now, we were a public-facing program, unlike ATIP, so we were more in common with the old U.S. Air Force Project Blue Book. We took reports from the public. We investigated those. You could look us up in the phone book. We weren't a secret. We did some classified work.
Interesting. Okay.
So there are similarities with ATIP, but differences too.
I'm a little bit off on that because that makes sense from your end, but I didn't realize ATIP. I know that I guess the desk itself was secret for a long time, but when public reportings happened, my understanding was that they were in charge of looking into that. You just, as you put it, couldn't find them in the phone book. Is that the only difference you're pointing out?
Well, ATIP, no, I would say it goes further than that. I'm not sure. And, of course, Congress is getting into this at the moment. I'm not sure there was, for example, proper congressional oversight of the ATIP program. It was kind of buried and disguised as something else. And even when the Defense Intelligence Agency wrote to Congress in January of 2018, just a few weeks after the New York Times broke the story about ATIP, they were still trying to dress it up, and they were saying ATIP is a program that looked at next generation aircraft and weapon threats to the US, which was just not true, because they attached at Annex a list of the studies that they'd done under the ATIP program, and none of them were about Russia or China or aircraft production or drones or missiles. They were all about anti-gravity, invisibility, warp drive, wormholes, stargates, all that kind of weird X-Files stuff.
Yeah. And for your whole life, though, leading up to this, I guess, how old were you when you went to that desk?
Gosh, I think mid-20s, I guess. So I was at the junior managerial grade,
interesting.
which was the grade was called executive officer, and it was the first rung on the management chain that would eventually take you up to the senior civil service. So I was, not at the time, obviously, that far progressed in my career, but it was one of those niche jobs that exist from time to time, where you are the deep specialist. And
I was going to say, you're on this, you're running it.
You are the subject matter expert. And if the Secretary of Defense gets, for example, a question in Parliament that needs to be responded to, I was the one drafting the answer.
And you're like 26.
I'm like 26 or whatever I was. Yeah. So it's, wow. But that's part of when you are identified, as I think I was, as a potential high flyer. They deliberately give you challenging jobs and deliberately pick those sorts of jobs where there isn't necessarily that kind of safety net of lots of other people who do the same thing, where really you are one of the only people who have that deep specialist knowledge of it, and it's sink or swim. And you are expected to swim.
Last month, I had in my friend Dr. Brian Keating for episode 173 of the podcast. And I really appreciate all the amazing feedback we had on that one. It won't be the last episode we do together. I really enjoyed talking with Brian. He's such a smart guy and obviously very keyed into the entire physics community in addition to physics. But in that episode, almost 84% of the people who watched were not subscribed. And so what happens when we have a lot of non-subscribers watching who aren't hitting the button is YouTube does not put these videos into the algorithm. So that episode did fine, but it didn't do amazing despite the fact that the click-through, the watch time were all great, and like I said, the feedback was awesome. So if you'd like to see this podcast get into the algorithm more and get some more support behind it so that we can get great guests like Brian to come in here, please take a second and hit that subscribe button. It is a huge, huge help, and I appreciate all of you who have already done so. What was your job for them immediately before getting that one?
Immediately before, I was a briefer, and so my job was to take large and complex amounts of information involving Royal Air Force personnel issues, and that could be anything from pensions through to medical and dental care, through to recruitment, retention, whatever it was, anything on the personnel side. I was the briefer for a post called AMP, which was the Air Member for Personnel. So I had to put his briefing packs together for the, I'm sorry, I'm throwing a lot of acronyms out, but you asked, there was a top-level personnel committee called the PPOs, which was the Principal Personnel Officers. And that's where basically the Army, the Navy, the Air Force get together to discuss personnel issues with a view to trying to integrate them and make sure that there aren't single service differences. It was that time when everything was about jointery and purple, as we called it. Make it purple. So don't have the Air Force do one thing and the Army do another, because otherwise the Air Force person will be saying, well, how come he gets all this medical and dental care that I don't?
Right.
So that was my job, briefing, putting together briefing packs for those meetings.
And in that kind of job, obviously, you're reporting to people.
Yes.
Whereas, meaning, let me better state that. you're not the head of the whole shebang. You're an important piece of the cog, but then they move you to something where you're technically like the head of the whole shebang with it.
Yes, because there really isn't. I mean, everyone's got a boss. So of course,
right.
I had a boss. He wrote my report. He had a boss, and and so on. But in terms of a boss who has that knowledge of the subject, no. With the UFO program, that was very much ring-fenced, and the subject matter expert, the executive officer posted to that position, is really, that's where the buck stops.